I'm told I'm on. I'm Professor Sears, and we're here to discuss editing, hopefully. And we have... That's all you have to say. So what we have Frank Marrone, we have Scott Weber, and we have Chris Nelson. And are we talking? Anyway, so welcome them, and we'll go on from there.
Yo, bring that big bad bass, drop the bass.
I'm a film editor.
I'm an educator.
I'm a beginner. I'm an independent filmmaker.
I'm a re-recording mixer.
I'm a composer.
I'm a cinematographer.
I'm a broadcaster.
I'm a DJ.
I'm a record producer.
I'm a live sound engineer.
As a record producer, I want to stay focused on the important stuff like storytelling and the emotional connection for the listener with the singer of the song, and that is immensely satisfying to me to see that go down like that.
I really got into filmmaking for the idea of emoting with people, of connecting with people and sharing ideas, and when that occurs and people feel something from what you're trying to say, that's a really special moment.
What I really like about working at USC with the students here is just watching them evolve from the first week they come in all the way until the end of their process here, and how they learn how to tell stories. And the development of these tools is affecting me so positively in the way in which I can teach.
You're no longer just a broadcaster, you're a multimedia corporation. You can do almost anything from your desktop. It's a wild ride. You are never done.
Creation is anywhere and everywhere, and when an idea comes to mind, I can make it happen right then. I love that. If you're lucky enough to have a film that translates to people, where they actually are impacted on an emotional level, on an intellectual level, it's a very gratifying process to go and have that conversation all over the world. And it's like living the dream, you know?
Probably the greatest opportunity in the process of editing is to influence the end result. Rising to the occasion is what it's all about.
Well, what I love about my job is that I get to create sounds all day. Mixing and blending sounds and creating that sort of thing is every bit as much of a creative art as being a musician is.
Every day that I get to mix a different band, I become more and more of a creative individual.
Music is such an all-encompassing art form like painting. You have to know something about what it is you're doing with it artistically to be able to get so much more out of it.
figure out what works for you, then everything flows. For me, it's all about people dancing on the dance floor, controlling the whole party.
Who thinks of this stuff?
Yeah. Woo.
Why are you on this island?
You were wrong!
What are you?
Why is my name written down on this? Why does he want me?
The time for questions is over.
I promise I'll tell you everything.
ABC's Lost, the final season. Tuesdays at 9/8 Central on ABC.
Woo! And ladies and gentlemen, I promise I will tell you everything about how this show is edited by the end of this session today. My name is George Klippel. I'm the Territory Account Manager for Education for Avid Technology for the Americas, and I have the privilege to bring the panel Lost here to SCAD. So welcome. Thank you. Before we get started, how many of you, by a show of hands, watched the series? All right. And,
All right.
very good.
Yeah.
And how many of you come from the typical or traditional video side of editing, if you will, by show of hands? How many of you are on the audio side? How many of you are here just to get their autographs? Well, let's get started. I wanted to start off before we get into today's agenda. Essentially, we're going to look at one of the scenes that these gentlemen worked on both the audio and video side, and kind of dissect it from the beginning to the piece that went to air, and go through it in detail. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We are going to take some Q&A at the end of the session. If we don't get it all done in time here, we'll take some Q&A outside. They said they'd hang out by the street and answer questions as long as we needed to. And you also got a little ticket. Hopefully, if you get this ticket, you're going to have a chance to win Media Composer 5 software, the same software that was used to edit Lost. So you could be a Lost editor yourself one of these days. So thank you very much. Let's get started down at the far end over there. Hi, can you see us, everybody?
Hi there.
So we have Scott Weber, Scott and Frank Marrone on the audio side, and Chris Nelson over here, the film editor. So first, if we can, Scott, let's start with you. What was your role on the show? Specifically, and how long were you with Lost?
Sure, my name is Scott Weber. I'm one of the re-recording sound mixers, and both Frank and I have been on the show, did the whole series. So for 6 years we worked on the show. Season 1 and 2, I mixed dialogue and music. Actually, just season 1.
Season 1.
And then season 2, we sort of, after evaluating our backgrounds, we switched chairs, and he mixed from season 2 through the end, dialogue and music, and I went over to sound effects.
And yeah, I guess he summed it up. I mean, I mixed the dialogue and the music on the show for the last 5 seasons, and we had a lot of fun with the show. It was pretty challenging in the sense that they really wanted the sound of the show as well as the visual end of the show to be a mini feature film every single week. So we were doing it in a fraction of the time that we get to do a feature film in. And so we had to develop certain workflows to make that happen. Basically, both of our backgrounds, both Scott and I have music backgrounds. We started in music studios, moved into post-production, and sort of both of us have been through every stage of the editorial process. We both edited music, edited dialogue, edited sound effects, and are now both in the re-recording chairs. And we both have experience in film and television mixing, and working on Lost was not that far, as I said, from mixing a feature film every week. So our workflow had to be really carefully thought out to be as efficient as possible. So.
And Chris, your role as film editor. How long were you on the show, and what else did you do?
I came out on season 3, so I worked on the last 4 years of the show. And in the normal episodic rotation, there's 3 editors. We rotate shows until the finale, and then the finale is always all hands on deck, and we usually hire an extra person. Like this season, or this series finale, there were 4 editors, and from the last day of dailies to lock picture was about a week on what was a 2 hour and 20-minute show, and with hundreds of visual effects. So it's always been demanding and fun. Lost is probably, my guess, is the most fun show one could cut in the episodic world because of the variety of situations on and off island. We tend to work isolated. People would ask, do you work with the other editors? And we tended to work by ourselves and only consult each other when, we were trying to find out if something matched or something,
So did you and Frank and Scott work together at least in the same building, or?
It's funny you should ask, because we did one of these together in Las Vegas last year, and it was really the first time we'd actually met. Because
seriously,
we all work in our little virtual worlds, and he finishes his side of the project and finishes it in lock picture, and then it hands off to us, and we really, even though we were literally 4 miles across town, we never really saw each other.
Yeah, episodic television is, although all the processes are the same as feature films, from the time you finish the editing process, where if you were in a film or something, the editor would then be part of the decision making and part of the process of supervising the sound and the ADR, maybe the scoring sessions, and then be part of the whole final mix. But in episodic TV, because we just grind this cycle over and over again, as soon as we're done with the picture cutting, it's just a handoff, and away we go.
Well, we tried in this venue to keep the separation still intact,
It
as
works.
you can tell by our seating location. If you can for a minute, maybe take some of us through the whole process of how Lost, a program like Lost, is made, from conception all the way to air. It kind of sometimes is lost, no pun intended, on some folks, but there's a lot of work behind the scenes. It's not just running out there with the camera, shooting your scenes to the script, and then editing, and you're done.
Well, it's kind of like that, because it's a little more complex. Obviously, they shot in Hawaii. Our shooting schedule was 11 days, which is more than most shows. It would be 8 days of first unit, and the rest would be second unit. So, and it wasn't uncommon to have first and second unit shooting at the same time, and then a unit shooting pickups, and then another unit shooting like underwater stuff or something. So, on our end, we were always a day behind Hawaii because of the time change. So our film actually, instead of coming in the next day, it was always the day after. But we could be just buried in dailies. It was not uncommon to have 4.5, 5 hours of dailies per day on stuff. And I think that made it, it made us have to operate very efficiently in our selection process. I mean, in all honesty, we never watched dailies, because if you just don't have enough time to do that. So you would look at a scene, you'd look at the masters, you'd understand what it needed, and then kind of edit it while you were watching it, becoming familiar with it. Because to take 5 hours out of your day, out of a 12 or 14-hour day, just to watch it, you couldn't do it. Once we're done with the editing process, we have a spotting session, where one for the sound effects people, where the sound supervisor comes and takes notes on ADR, anything that we've done to our temp soundtrack that we want to keep going, any theories we have on that, and then he leaves, and we have a spotting session with the music editor, who passes all the music information on to the composer. And then at that point, it really is a handoff to these guys, other than after your first full pass of the mix, they would send me a DVD so I could just review it and make sure that ADR lines weren't left out, or that there wasn't something seriously different, in my opinion, than something I was hoping to have sound-wise.
Now, how many cameras were used on this show?
Generally 2, all the time. So in the practical sense of that, is 5 hours of dailies is really only 4.5 or 2.5 hours times 2. So it wasn't like 5 hours complete.
And how much footage would you end up with per episode? An hour-long episode is what, 42,
42:27 or something like that is what it turned out to be. We did have a couple of shows, one that I did in season 5 that was 3.5 minutes over. And actually the series finale was supposed to just be 2 42-minute shows. And we were 20 minutes over, something like that, wasn't it? And, you know, they called the network and said, so we're kind of long. Are you okay with that? And they made a whole evening of it. They were totally happy with it.
Now, when you're finishing the piece and when you're doing the editing and you've got only so much time, are you working in chunks? Are you taking the first half of the show, finishing it, locking it down, then passing it on to
No, the whole
Frank and
show.
Scott?
The entire show. I've worked on shows where the schedule was so rushed where we had to deliver, you know, we had to fix and lock it segmentally. But the danger in that is you're telling an arc of a whole story, and if you take the first couple acts and lock them, then you go on to edit the rest of the show. You may discover things that you needed to fix in the first part. So only if your back is completely against the wall, I think, we would ever do that.
So once the picture's locked and you've spotted it and you've sent it over to sound, who gets it over there first? Frank, Scott?
Actually, the editorial team are the first people. He mentioned that the supervising sound editor would do a spotting session. So he takes notes on lines that have to be looped or replaced, so they would go into the studio with the actors and replace those. He would give the sound design notes to the sound effects and sound designers so they could go off and design. And so all that had to happen typically in the course of a week. So from picture lock until it came to the mixing stage is about a week's time.
Yeah, and with that, you have to remember with this show, it was not typical because we would have a 40-piece orchestra scoring every single show every week. So the music was fresh, and the composer was having to turn that around in a week. We also have a team of people between the Foley editors, the Foley recordists to check sync on the Foley. We have, as Scott mentioned, we do ADR. That ADR has to be cut into the show. A dialogue editor works on the show and has to go through it and prepare the dialogue. Sound effects editors work on that part of it, and so everything sort of comes together on our dubbing stage when that crew, which is typically a crew of about 10 people.
Yeah, no, interesting. We talked about from the start of the shoot on location. You're shooting picture, you're shooting sound, but really, from the point it hits Chris's to do the picture editorial, sound and picture do this. They go in two different directions. And so what he's cutting is really just a temporary track to what's going to be the final soundtrack. So when we get the final lock picture, we're going to reassemble the entire soundtrack from the multi-channel track. So on location, our location sound person is recording isolated tracks. So he'll have the boom on a track, he'll have individual lavs on every single actor that we can use in the sound mix, which Chris doesn't deal with at all.
No, I typically get a composite of that.
Right. So
or whatever the mixer decides. So certain decisions I might be making based on sound quality may not be valid because I can't hear, if there's too much noise, I can't hear what does the lavalier on that sound like. And, but regardless of what I do, when that passes on to the sound people, the sound effects people, or the dialogue editors, they separate that all out and take the best of what there is.
Then by the time it hits the stage, then the dialogue editor's prepared it in such a way so when Frank gets it, he's already has the correct angle or mic of which is the choice that the editor thinks is best for the scene.
Right. I do have available to me the original multi-track that was shot on location. And sometimes I'll occasionally go down and see if, you know, two of the angles aren't matching sonically, then I can go down and listen to all the different tracks and see if there's a better track with, you know, sometimes I find that, you know, the boom works better than the lav if you get, you know, it's sounding too close. So I have those choices that I can make. And my job typically when I do get the tracks is on this particular, on Lost, it was sort of it was a difficult show to mix dialogue on because a lot of it was shot on the beach, and if they pointed the mic one way, you'd get all the waves crashing in. If they pointed the mic the other way, the location, the people who picked the location picked it right behind a highway and right near to a military base. So we'd hear Mack trucks going by on a deserted island that we had to get rid of, as you know. And so the challenges in mixing the dialogue were to try and make it as clean as possible, and at the same time keep it sounding natural, because it's very easy to over-process dialogue to try and get it as clean as you can. So that was one of the challenges. You know, we faced a lot of other challenges. On the season finale, we ended up with between 300 and 400 audio tracks, between the sound effects, the dialogue, the music, the Foley, the backgrounds, and you know, it's interesting because when we would have things like the monster come into play, I mean, Scott would typically keep getting updates that were 60 tracks at a time that he'd have to sort of try and figure out, where do I put this next batch of tracks? We have our sessions spread out over 6 Pro Tools systems, and we have a 7th recorder.
Thanks for talking about that. This is the room where we mix the show. This is room 6 at Disney Studios. And here, one more slide here while we're talking about it. So on the left side is the 32 fader decontrol surface where I mix the sound effects. And then we have a 16 fader decontrol on the right where Frank mixes the dialogue and music. And I just put some, to see what monitors we have, we like to basically have a monitor for every Pro Tool so we can have a virtual cue sheet. So we have the Foley and the backgrounds and effects and the music and the ADR and the dialogue all on separate Pro Tools and on separate monitors, so that during the mix we can see all those things coming up and we can mix them together.
Yeah, but you didn't wear those different hats on the entire show, so you didn't run out of the room to do Foley for an hour and come back and do ADR later, right? You have a whole team behind you.
Yeah, fortunately all that happened before it got to us, and when it got
That's
to
in that 5-day window, right?
Correct, in that 7-day window, yeah.
Did either of you do any of those other positions before becoming a sound re-recording mixer, or did you work in Foley or ADR or those types of things?
And interesting you should ask. We have a very similar background where we both started working as recording engineers in recording studios, and started in post-production, and both mixed some Foley and did some dialogue and sound effects editing, and you know, and then having that kind of background then to mix here is I think is invaluable to being able to do this kind of show.
Yeah, we have a tremendous amount of respect for the editors that we work with, because we've sort of been in their shoes, and we're pretty familiar with what they go through, especially my dialogue editor. I see how much cutting he does to get the tracks to the point that they're at. You know, he'll cut out little ticks and pops and clicks, and as I see the session going by, you know, I really appreciate how much work he's done. And I think that's important, because, I mean, we are all working as a team, and understanding that is really important to make the whole flow go smoothly of getting the show done on time. And you know, now that we finally met Chris, we've been talking more on the video side of things. So
what about
now they know who to blame.
Yeah, well, what about your background too, Chris? Did you work in a lot of different roles before landing in the film seat to get on this series?
Actually not. I mean, it's a cliche. I started in the mailroom at Universal and had no training for this. I went to the stock film library, where I spent some time, and then I became an assistant editor. And then within 2.5 years of being an assistant editor, I was an editor. In those days, the union had an 8-year rule. You had to be in the union for 8 years before you could be an editor. It's now not there, so don't worry. And I've mostly worked in television. I've cut on a variety of series. I've done over 20 pilots and another 25 movie of the weeks. Only recently returned to series because the TV movie marketplace has kind of dried up a little bit. But was lucky enough to fall onto Lost when that happened. That's almost like doing a feature every week with the variety of storylines and all the different kinds of challenges and scenes and settings that Lost has to offer between the online and off, on-island and off-island story, from childbirth to kung fu fights to, God, there's nothing that you can, there's not a situation in film that you can't think of that Lost didn't do once, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were lucky in the sense that we got to create a lot of the environments. We got to create, work with the sound designers to create what the monster sounded like, what the hatch sounded like, what the island itself sounded like. Those were a lot of fun to do and create. I like to relate, I don't know if a lot of you have obviously seen the smoke monster in the show. Well, there's a sound that's like this ticking sound as the monster is approaching, and that sound is, I recorded that in New York. That's a sound of a receipt being printed in a taxi cab, and that sound became the signature sound of the monster approaching and leaving.
There's a lot of other sounds in there too, which are one of the instructions early on, first season one, they were trying to create the sound of the smoke monster, and they didn't want it to be Jurassic Park, so it couldn't be a dinosaur, but they wanted it to have some kind of organic feel or mechanical thing. So we have this sort of hybrid creature thing that sort of we established, and it kept evolving. I don't think we ever really nailed down exactly what it sounded like, but you know, you'll hear the sound of a roller coaster. In the last season, we started adding the sound of a locomotive. We had some sounds of that, and then of course the airy and the whooshy qualities, and we did sneak in some growls and different things in there too. So this sort of thing morphed into what we knew as a smoke monster.
I think it's interesting to note, you know, Frank said on the finale they had 300 to 400 units of tracks, and the point of comparison is Star Wars had 125. And however, whatever time schedule they were on, these guys do this in 3 or 4 days with that much more material. Obviously, technology has allowed that to happen in a way that was never possible in the old days, but nonetheless, that's a lot of material to manage on a weekly basis.
And how much material, or how many tracks typically on the video side would you end up working with?
Well, for me, actually, to make my editing less cumbersome, I try to keep my audio tracks to 8. Sometimes I have to go beyond that, and it just becomes less manageable as far as making changes quickly and moving the material. If you start to stack up too many video tracks because of visual effects and too many audio tracks, you spend all your time just trying to make sure you didn't screw something up rather than just doing the work you want to do. So I try to keep it to, my top 2 audio tracks are just dialogue, and then like 3 through 6 will be hard effects, maybe some wild lines, maybe in backgrounds, and then I leave my last 2 tracks for stereo music. And we have like a typical first cut, editor's cut, the first time anyone sees it. I've got 33, 35 minutes of tracked music in the show. So just in general, that has become a large part of our job. Increasingly, people want more and more music. They want it not just kind of laid in, but tracked so it fits. And if you know Lost, you know, every little sting in music is kind of almost like a cartoon. Every nuance of, you know, scare and uh-oh or whatever is underlined with music. So it's a big job, but that's actually, as much as anything, the most fun part of the job.
How many video layers with visual effects and everything else did you typically run through in a show?
We could get up to 5 or 6 video layers. Sometimes I would ask my assistant just to do a mix down on that stuff because it just was cumbersome for me. And when we were down near the end of the process and we were getting new visual effects every day, they would, rather than cutting the new one over the top of the old one, they would stack the visual effects up in units so we could always refer back to the last one, the one before that, the one before that. So after I'm done editing and they're getting in visual effects and finals and finals and then doing them again, it could be probably 7 or 8 layers thick. Only looking at the top layer, though, in that case. They're not really trying to use them as composites. They're just trying to always have a reference from whatever the first one was to the last one. So if in an instant, if they want to say, well, what was that other one like? It's there. They don't have to go look it up or anything.
So all of you seem to be dealing with large quantities of material, whether it's audio or video or vis effects. And you mentioned this just a few minutes ago. You came up through an assistant's rank, if you will. How important is an assistant editor to you on a program like this?
Oh, indispensable. Absolutely. As our world has become, well, because of Avid, as we've been able to deliver to the people that we show the show to a more finished-looking product, the expectations of that product being looking and sounding more like the finished product have grown. Now we cut in HD, so it looks better than most of the broadcast at home. You know, so the visual effects, my assistant right now can make stuff that looks almost like, I mean, not everything, obviously, but he can do things that I'm always astonished, and I can't even tell he's monkeyed with it. So he's really good. And knowing that as an assistant editor, I think, is a really big, important part of the thing. That for those of you that are really looking towards going into this, knowing the technology, knowing Avid inside and out, knowing what it can do in every aspect is going to be the key that unlocks the door wherever you go. If you don't know that, you will then be playing catch-up. And I think our business is really competitive. And so knowing as much as you can know, knowing, you know, the practical application, you know, just raw knowledge by itself isn't the key. You need to have a certain amount of creative, let's say, common sense to be able to take all this knowledge and find maybe new and creative ways how to solve problems, because we face them all the time.
And Frank and Scott, do you agree with that as well? And do you have assistants helping you through this process in your team?
Ours is sort of a different process. Our, you know, we rely more on the editors. They're not really our assistants. They're more our counterparts in the process. But we have to plan ahead to be able to handle these kind of tracks. On the sound effects side, for instance, I have the editors cut in groups of tracks. So for sound effects, they cut in groups of 8 tracks. And what that lays out for me on the D-Command control surface is a perfect custom fader bank of 8 tracks. So the first set of tracks might be the car sound effect, driving up, stopping, and the next set of tracks might be the doors opening and closing, and the next set of tracks might be some other gunshots or something in the scene. And what happens, that just took up 24 tracks of stuff, but on the control surface, I assign those to master faders, and that's only 3 faders on the surface. So you can see how that 8 times whatever, I can manage an entire complicated sequence because my editor has managed it in such a way that I have control of groups of tracks, and they're also doing volume graphing and other things ahead of time so that when it gets to me, I don't have to weed through all those tracks. They've already sort of pre-balanced them, and then I can overall have them on master tracks that I can start, adjusting those in broad strokes.
And with the dialogue and the ADR editors, I've given them copies of my templates so they know exactly how my tracks are laid out on the console, how they come up. So they lay out their tracks on my dialogue template because I split out all the foreign dialogue, I split out the principal dialogue, I split out the ADR, I split out the production effects that we strip off wherever we can. I split out the X tracks, which are tracks that have been revoiced or redone because of noise problems or because of line changes in the show. So both of them, we've communicated what I need as far as the layouts go, and so that when I receive their tracks, I'm just bringing it into my session, and I don't have to sit there and go track by track and lay it out the way I want it.
I think a good point to make here, we talked to a student a few weeks ago, we'd done another one of these conferences, and he says, well, how do you handle all those tracks? Doesn't it get confusing? And the one thing I thought about, the best advice I think for that is anything that's complicated like that, go down to the simplest thing. So start with one simple thing, and if it's audio, maybe go through and do a whole pass and just mix the one particular thing. It might be the car thing, and get that just right. And then go through and attack another little piece. So you do all these little tasks, and once all the little tasks are done, you can handle the larger task.
I think my area in some ways is not different than that. If you look at certain scenes, or you get 5 or 6 hours of dailies and you're already 2 days behind, so you're 18 hours behind. If you stop to look at the total, it would be overwhelming. But it's always just try to manage it down to what do I have in front of me. And even in a single scene, you're only going to use any single piece at any single moment in time. So all those options aren't really options at that moment in time. You're going to use the master to a certain point, and then you're really not going to think about that. So you can put that away. And once you've worked in and you think you want to stay in close-ups, then those are the only desirable pieces at that point, and you don't have the other stuff to worry about. So if you can kind of compartmentalize it so you don't think of it as the total, it's just what options do I want to examine now? And it's not examining those options, it's just saying, cool, I don't have to examine all those options right now.
Well, one of the things that I learned at lunch with the gentleman here was that sometimes you work on a scene or an element that you scripted one way or think's going to be going one way, and it kind of ends up going entirely different. And I think we have an example to that we're going to show today of an emergency landing that was done in the show. So Chris, why don't you maybe kick us off and kind of explain what we're going to see and how this process went.
Okay. Well, don't start yet.
Nope.
As we started to do this, Frank and Scott and I talked about something that would have all the elements necessary, that we could talk about here, from storytelling to editing, visual effects, and then also complicated sound work. And this scene is pretty much the perfect example. I'll tell you the story of how it was scripted and what we did, and then we'll show you essentially my very first cut that I showed to the director. Simple story, we're in a cockpit, they're on the Ajira plane on their way back to the island, hoping something's going to happen and make them land or transport them in some way. The pilot, Lapidus, is nervous, and then all of a sudden the plane starts to shake and it starts to go into a roll, and they can't control the plane. And in the script, the plane was supposed to roll over, but they couldn't make that happen on set. So they kind of abandoned that idea, which we did pick up in post-production. But anyway, the plane rolls over, there's a flash of light, and they were supposed to be, there's a mountain right in front of them. You're supposed to pull up quickly, go over the mountain, and there's a landing strip. And that was end of thing. What happened was when I got the film in, and everything in the cockpit is green screen, so we can change anything outside the windows. So when I got the film, the pilot didn't seem to pull up to go over a mountain. There was a lot of different elements, and it seemed to me also, if you went from night to day, maybe that would be the first thing you would notice, a moment of, oh my God, what just happened? And then, oh my God, what's in front of us? So my first pass was knowing that I couldn't try to change it too far from the original intent, but that I wanted to try to make order of what I had so it makes sense. And so you'll see a lot of banners that say this is going to happen or that's going to happen. You'll see stock shots of airplanes and stuff that we just snagged off the web, just to use as filler pieces to help try to figure out a structure of what this scene should be. And the director, Jack Bender, who is the executive producer, director in Hawaii, he knew enough to when I said, he agreed with me that something needed to be done, but during his cut, we never changed a frame of it because he wanted the guys to see it, Damon and Carlton, and then have a further discussion of actually what this scene should be. So why don't we just show this first one, which is pretty, it's the way it was scripted with me trying to make a little more sense and order out of it.
Want to hear something crazy?
What's that?
Did you see the big guy when we got on in L.A.? Sitting in first class, curly hair, dark eyes.
What about him?
Well, I knew I'd seen him before. I couldn't remember where. Then it hit me. He's one of the Oceanic Six. Guy's got nerves of steel, man. He survives a full-on commercial airliner crash. Now he's back flying over the same South Pacific.
Yeah, well, maybe he doesn't believe that lightning will strike twice in the same place.
You look like you're landing at LaGuardia in a snowstorm there, buddy. Gotta relax. Visibility's 50 plus. There's no land or air traffic within 400 miles of us. You all right there, Frank?
I'm just fine. Oh, no.
What?
I have control. Floor right rider! Give me more power, I can pull us out of this.
You're gonna rip us apart.
Do it!
Altimeter reading, 650. What the hell? We've lost power.
15, 16, 23, 42.
Full flaps! Gear down, airspeed 190. Coming in too steep! We stick this or we die! Reverse thrusters! Come on. Come on. We're running out! We're running out! Hold on!
Okay, so you can see you have to use a lot of imagination when you're trying to put one of these things together because you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. And some of the pieces of the puzzle you have don't fit very well. After Damon and Carlton got into it, we discussed from this point of view what we should do next. And he basically handed off to Carlton because Carlton was really interested in the airplane stuff. So we discussed it, and I went, you know, my initial thought was going from night to day is a big deal. So shouldn't there be a series of events rather than just one, oh my God, we're going to crash into a mountain kind of thing? And I suggested, what if they come out and it's day and they're above a sea of clouds? And just as they go, the engines fail, and they drop through the clouds, and that's where the island is. And then we discussed that, he liked that, and it was like, instead of pulling up over the mountain and seeing an airstrip, that seems really convenient. So what about if they bank to miss the island, which only turns them into another mountain, which then banks them into a canyon, and then ultimately, as they come out of the canyon, they see the airstrip. So that became the ultimate flight path of the plane. And everything out the windows was going to be CG. We didn't shoot any practical stuff. So that was a big challenge on the visual effects side, and in some cases it never got much better than a video game. But as you notice, there was shake in there. You know, their camera was shaking in the cockpit. Ultimately, we added a lot more shake than was there. And just for you doing this, editors, if you find a shot that has shake on it and do stabilize, it will then create a pattern to try to stabilize that shake. Then you put that effect over on something that's stable, and it looks like it's shaking. So there's a way to take it and run it in reverse, and you create kind of a natural thing, which is, it took us a while to figure that one out, but it actually does work, because we put a lot of shake. If you saw the series finale, it shook for like an hour.
No, but this first cut that we just saw, Frank and Scott weren't involved in this at all.
No. So what sound you hear is just my temp. It's just my first pass at that, trying to just give enough music and sound effects to support the story so we kind of get a feeling of what it is. I actually forget exactly where this next clip is, but one thing that Damon did want to do, rather than just be in the cockpit the whole time, the previous week we basically started the show with the same story, except we were in the passenger compartment with our losties coming back to the island. So it wasn't just Lapidus in the cockpit. And he said, let's integrate that too. And so I had to go back through the previous show and try to glean out material that didn't look like a repeat. So it had a different emotional arc to it, or a sense of tense anticipation compared to what they shot originally. And the other thing was they had said, oh yeah, and we really want the plane to roll over. And just so you know, rolling an image, a 16:9 image in Avid is a 225% blow up. That's what it takes to be able to roll the image without seeing any corners on it. So there's stuff where we did that, and so that's why they're so large. One thing for me as an editor, when we started to figure out how to try to do this roll, I'm trying to figure out a speed of the roll and then cutting to a variety of characters during the roll, and then speed in that stuff is kind of in ratio to duration of cut, and every time you would change something, then the speed would look wrong and you'd have to redo the whole thing over again. And then, by the way, by this next point, we were temping in backgrounds outside the windows, so once we started to roll the cockpit, we had to roll the black backgrounds and the green screen, and this is all stuff just done between my assistant and I. I would do the foreground stuff and say, okay, that stuff out the window, it doesn't work anymore, you have to fix that, and then I would hand it off to him. So, should we show the next one?
Yeah.
Want to hear something crazy?
What's that?
Did you see the big guy when we got on in L.A.? Sitting in first class, curly hair, guitar case.
What about him?
He's one of the Oceanic Six. Guy's got nerves of steel, man. He survives a full-on commercial airliner crash. Now he's back flying over the same South Pacific.
Yeah, well, maybe he doesn't believe that lightning will strike twice in the same place.
You look like you're landing at LaGuardia in a snowstorm there, buddy. You all right there, Frank?
I'm just fine.
Dude, you might want to fasten your seatbelt.
Oh, no.
What?
Give me more power, I can pull us out of this! You're gonna rip us apart. Do it! Runway? What the? Massive instrument failure, we're putting her down! Full flaps! Gear down, airspeed 190! We're coming in too steep! Reverse thrusters! Come on! We're running out! We're running out! Hold on!
So another step in the evolution, closer to what we wound up with. And I guess it's time to pass off to you guys.
Well, I have to tell you, every time I'm on a flight and it hits turbulence, I'm hoping it doesn't roll over after watching it, because by the time we finished mixing the show, we watched it about 30 times. So That scene still freaks me out.
It's not real, it's only Avid Shake.
Yeah.
But of course, every time there was what would happen is these guys would, we'd get the first lock cut of the picture, and they'd have a certain number of shakes already in the show. So we'd go, the editors would have cut all the appropriate things. Every time the shake happens, we'd hear a rattle, rattle. We'd put a little in the subwoofer, and we'd move along. Well, what happened is they kept cutting. They would ask for more shakes, so they'd add more shakes, and we'd have to go through, and we'd have to add more sound effects. And so, you know, we were still chasing shakes.
Right down to the end.
Right down to the end.
Because in the very final visual effects pass, the island, the trees and everything, the jungle outside through the windows, still looked not real. And so the only way we could think to muddy it up a little was we created this very, you know, subtle high-frequency shake and everything. So there was just like this, and it was enough to blur the background to where you no longer, you know, would look at it and go, well, that doesn't look real. So, and we kept adding and adding layers of that stuff. As we'd see one visual effect, we'd then say, well, gee, could you do more here? Because that one worked really good. And then update for them.
Well, just before we get to the audio side on this one to finish it, what happens if you didn't have the footage that you needed to, you know, like you said, it wasn't really resonating? Do they go back and reshoot? Do they go back and bring more sound in? Or?
We did reshoot a lot on Lost. They weren't for this because they brought this cockpit over to the island to shoot this scene, and it was gone. So it wasn't there for inserts. We couldn't do anything. It was gone. So we made do. You will see in the final, if you look at some of the instruments that I had in, I would just put cuts of instruments with a banner on it that say instrument doing this, and then the visual effects people would make an instrument that fit in that gauge that looked like what I wanted the storytelling to be. Pretty much same thing out the window as far as the rolling over, all that stuff. We, you know, at a certain point, once we start to detail in how this whole thing is supposed to happen, then we work really closely with the visual effects guys. As you can see, a lot of the landing structure is not that dissimilar from the first, as far as pieces of the puzzle, dissimilar from my first cut. And you will see in the finale, it's not that far away too. So as an editor, what you're doing in these kinds of scenes is you are using your imagination and trying to imagine the pieces you don't have and build a structure that ultimately is going to work.
You know, I think one of the interesting things that happened to us mixing this scene is the composer went off and built a wonderful score that scored everything they went through. The sound designers went and cut a bunch of great sound effects that did all this cool stuff, and we got to the stage, and it was faders up, and it was loud, and it was big, and there was no detail. It all just sort of went away. So at a certain point, we had to decide what was going to play. And we sort of go through this discussion a lot, where is this a musical moment? Is this a sound effects moment? Do we need to lay back and let the dialogue come through? And I think what finally came out of it worked out really well, because at one point you'll hear the score's big, and then the music goes away. And then we have a sound effect moment for a while, and then the score comes back in to sort of increase the tension at the end. So it's sort of a real nice balance of between sound effects and music and dialogue.
Yeah, we did that a lot in the show. We'd have to sort of, once we did our pass-through, we'd have to look at each other and decide, you know, and again, what Chris would give us as a template, we would use, you know, we would sort of have a pretty good indication of whether it was going to be a musical moment or a sound effects moment. But a lot of that, too, fell on us as far as how do we make that work effectively, because when Chris would temp it in, it would sort of be a minimal amount of sound effects that were in there, and once we would get a scene like this where, what did you have, how many tracks of sound effects did you have in it? Because by the time the scene was finished building and we got all the visuals, you were up to 120.
It was easily 150, 200 tracks. And the reason it kept building that way is I start with the base of 64 sound effects tracks and about 45 background tracks. So right off the bat, I have about 112 tracks plus Foley. So it's about 120, 130 tracks. And then every layer they add, and this is one of the great things working in Pro Tools, where it's a virtual mixer, is I can just keep adding tracks. And because I have 3 systems, I can have up to 190 tracks, 192 voices per systems. I have the flexibility of adding all these things. So it did exponentially keep building, because we'd add another layer of shakes, we'd add another layer of, there's another airplane sound they wanted for something. So that's why it kept evolving and getting bigger.
the interesting thing was when we did the first screening for the executive producer, one of the notes we got back was, we want louder dialogue, louder music, and louder sound effects. And we
That's
said,
typical.
okay, that's very typical. So we had to sort of do a little bit of a dance on this scene to get it all to work. And ultimately it did end up working well, but you know, Scott's point is something you should always keep in mind, that more isn't always better. Sometimes it's better to go through and pare things down and see what's going to speak and what's going to play, because the score was huge. Yeah. The score was just, if you heard the score on its own, I mean, it was massive, and he did a fantastic job. But if you played the score, you couldn't play the effects, and if you played the effects, you couldn't play the score. So,
but what happens a lot of times on a scene, a big complicated scene like that, is you have to start picking the things that are really going to play. So, you know, the other layer of low indie gronky stuff is just going to make everything muddy. So I had to start removing things. So we start removing what's taking up the sound space. So we'd start removing certain things, and then we'd play the things that would poke through, and not just, you know, have this big wall of sound that was just getting muddy.
Yeah. So
you want to hear the last final scene?
Absolutely.
So this is what we ended up with. Yeah.
We think we will. Try this one more time.
This is the sound part you can tell.
Granted, this isn't a 5.1, but we'll do.
Want to hear something crazy?
What's that?
Did you see the big guy when we got on in L.A.? Sitting in first class, curly hair, guitar case.
What about him?
He's one of the Oceanic Six. Guy's got nerves of steel, man. He survives a full-on commercial airliner crash. Now he's back flying over the same South Pacific.
Yeah, well, maybe he doesn't believe that lightning will strike twice in the same place.
You all right there, Frank?
I'm just fine.
Dude, you might want to fasten your seatbelt.
Oh no.
What?
Autopilot off! I have the controls. Autopilot off. You have the controls. All right, right. What?
Stall.
We've lost power!
Stall.
Restarting 1. Restarting 2. Altimeter reading 650.
Oh my God.
Give me more power, I can pull us out of this! You're gonna rip us apart! Do it!
Come on. Come on.
Is that a runway? Massive instrument failure, we're putting her down! Mayday, 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 this is the Jira 316. Mayday, mayday, mayday! Full flaps! Gear down, airspeed 190.
Ultimately, the effects won out. I wonder how many people picked up that the lottery numbers were coming over the radio when he was calling into the tower.
It was scripted.
Yeah.
More people than we imagine, I guess.
Yeah.
I've got one last quick question before we're going to turn it over to the folks in the audience who have some questions for you, I'm sure. How much freedom do you have in the editing bay, if you will, when you're cutting something like that? Do you have a producer or director sitting right over your shoulder every step of the way, or do you have some freedom on your own to get creative and come up with the first cut and passes like that?
Generally speaking, they're never in the room. Typically everybody works differently. There are producers you'll work for who want to micromanage every moment, and then there's other people that, like Damon and Carlton, that when they trust you, they are busy people. They have a lot to do, so they want to come in, give you their thoughts, and then leave. And even I think on the show, my last show before the series finale, I was like 12 or 13 minutes over when I showed it to them. And basically it was a sound show, and they kind of went, too long, and I went, yep, too long, and they said, take some out. And next time I showed it to them, it was 3.5 minutes over. And I took a lot of dialogue out, and I think only in one or two places they asked to put it back. And also occasionally there may be a troublesome scene that it's either performance or there's something going on, and then they'll want to come in and look at all the takes with you or something. But that would only be if there was just something that wasn't working or wasn't meeting their expectation. But generally speaking, especially in the realm of television, we work autonomously all the time. Nobody hangs out with us. We get very little input prior to our cut. Actually, I confess, I don't even look at the line script while I'm cutting it. I don't want to know what the director thought. I find it just confuses me and makes me second guess myself, so I would rather just trust my own instincts and live or die on those.
Same on the audio side?
We actually get about 2 days before they come in and to work through the show. So it's the editors, it's the mixers pass, and we work through the show, and it gives us a chance to to mix it how we think it should be. We sort of amongst ourselves balance it how we think it should be with the music and the sound effects. And then at the end of that second day is when the producers come in and we have a playback. And that's when the process of they give us notes, and we spend another couple of days just making all the fixes and changes that they want.
More dialogue, more music, more sound effects.
Louder, 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 right?
Louder, louder, louder.
Well, we'd like to open it up to questions in the room, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and somebody will be around with a microphone. And there's a couple over here, there, everywhere. Please, go ahead.
Hello. My question is with script supervising, do you ever get script supervising notes? And also with your assistant editor, what's the turnaround time from assuming that you are syncing dailies potentially? Like, does that even happen? Like, what is
dailies are still sunk, but they're sunk when they show up at our place. So daily, we get, let's see. On the show I'm working on now, they show up on Drive. On Lost, they actually were posted to a server, and they were just downloaded. And our pipe to the server could download, 4.5 hours of dailies in maybe 20 minutes. And the script supervisor, all the notes, every day with the new film, the script supervisor's notes show up. Which is the circle takes, how they line to the script, all the notations they make as far as what each scene and take is, what it is, the lens that was used. They put that down in case they have to reshoot something. They'll know exactly. They don't have to try to guess. They'll know what that is. Any information is passed on right away. Like I said, I don't look at it at all. If you've seen a line script, there's like the back page that has all the writing, and then there's the page with just the script part with the lines on it. That's the only, I just take all the other pages out of my book, and my assistant keeps them in case we have to refer them, and I only look at the lined pages, if I look at all.
Another question?
Hi, my question goes to the sound guys. What was your favorite supernatural sound effect to create? I say second to the smoke monster because I assume that's your favorite. It might not be.
Well, every time we would get a scene like this with the plane going, on there. It was interesting to make it work because, you know, Scott would have to go through a lot of elements as far as the wing, the engine groinks, and then that fills up, because of the nature of it, that fills up a really large part of the sound spectrum. And I think, you know, trying to get music to work with that, I mean, that to me is where the challenge is, and that's where it's fun to.
Sure, I think one of the things I liked most about working on the show in general over the 6 years is that everything is an environment. Every place we go, we're on the beach, it's got waves and birds and wind, and we go into the jungle and it's cool stuff going on, and then we go to the hatch and we got this whole cool vibe happening. Or when we created the aqua hatch at the beginning of season 3, it's like we're in a submarine, because they wanted these watery sounds, but they wanted metallic, and they wanted some like metal gronks and stuff. So I think for me, probably the coolest thing is creating all these really great environments. And when you're mixing in 5.1, all of a sudden we can put all these cool things in the surrounds, and you know, we can add stuff in the subs, and sort of a mixer's dream to be able to create that kind of stuff and use the full spectrum of sound that we have available to us.
And even with the dialogue, when we're inside the sub or inside the hatch, you get an opportunity, because all the dialogue comes to you off the lavs. It's pretty dry, so you get an opportunity to imagine what that place would sound like as far as the reflections go. And the great thing about Pro Tools is once I establish that, I just store it as a preset, and then every time we go back to it, it comes back. And so once you've created it, you don't ever have to worry about it, because over the seasons, it was important that we maintained continuity and consistency with the environments we did create. So, with Pro Tools, it's such a great it gives you the ability to be able to go back to that and know that that's what you had after you work on a scene, and you get the dialogue sounding just right.
I actually have to disagree with the smoke monster being one of my favorite things, because it probably was one of my least favorite things, just for the fact that no one ever, it was sort of established, but it never was. So every time we saw that there was an episode with a smoke monster, we just sort of, oh, here we go again, because they never could make up their mind. So we would do our first pass on it. We'd get notes from the producer. We'd come in, we'd change a whole bunch of stuff, bring in a whole bunch of new elements. And it wasn't until the end of the last day, Brian Burke, the creative executive, would come in, and he'd work for another 3 or 4 hours with us, tweaking this thing, which was a smoke monster. So it was really kind of a pain.
I think in the whole process, what I'm sure yours is exactly the same as mine. The things that are the most troubling are the things you work on most. And so if you happen to work on something that is just, it's wonderful, it almost doesn't even land in your memory because you've spent so little time on it. It's always the trouble stuff that you work on over and over again.
Another question in the back there?
For Chris, I was wondering if you might be able to give me a brief overview on your offline to online workflow when you're cutting.
On my offline?
Offline to bringing it online for the final master when you're cutting.
Okay. I mean, in a nutshell, dailies are delivered to us pre-sunk on Drive or whatever. My assistant brings them into the system. For my purposes, he just puts, he makes a bin for every scene, and he does nothing to organize it. I do that on my own because I use that as my own familiarization process, being that we don't have time to look at dailies and everything. A lot of editors want their assistants to arrange some, the bins exactly such for them. I find for myself, I would rather go spend the time and go through it and pick the frame I want each clip to be representative and how I want to arrange it, because it makes it easier for me. From that point, I cut for X amount of time. 2 days past last day's dailies, I run it for the director. The director gets 4 days, then he's gone, or less sometimes. Producers will typically go through the show 3 times, maybe 4 times over the course of the episode, and then we send it to the, on Lost, the studio and the network combined. Some shows send it to the studio first for approval, and then once we've made their changes, it goes to the network. But on Lost, we didn't have that problem, so we send it out to them. We typically would get their notes the next day and either address them or not, and lock picture. That was it. And a lot of cases on Lost, by the time we hit lock picture, we were already 3 or 4 days behind on our next show. So you know, where you were constantly chasing your tail.
What resolution did you work in typically?
DNX 36.
Okay, great. We have a couple of questions up front here too, if the mic's coming around. Okay.
Going back to the smoke monster.
The smoke monster, come on,
I was
man.
watching Walkabout again, the episode with John Locke. We find out he's in a wheelchair. And in one of his flashbacks, there was that ticket making noise. Was that an intentional foreshadowing, or was that just kind of happenstance and then you used that?
Nothing's happenstance.
Okay, I didn't think so. I mean, it is lost, you know. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just noticed that, and I was like, I wonder if
Yeah,
they did that on
typically, and
purpose.
if I remember correctly in that scene, we wanted to play it subtle and just sort of in the background. So you may or may not have caught it. But if you did catch it, you would think just what you thought. So, oh, is that supposed to be the smoke monster? But yes, it was.
Hey, in terms of dialogue, since there were a lot of scenes on beaches and wildlife and next to highways and such, like, what was the overall quality of the production sound, and how much ADR was actually had to be shot, and just that the whole
Well,
thing?
the dialogue came in pretty rough. If it was an interior set, the dialogue came in decent shape, but on all the exterior sets, because they really didn't have a lot of control over how much ambient noise there was. The big problem that we had with the dialogue, there were certain characters that when they're on the beach, they didn't project very much, and so sometimes the waves were louder than the dialogue, and those scenes we would have to bring them in for ADR, but we would try to use as little ADR as possible. The producer on the show gave me the time to go through and clean the dialogue as best I could, because he always wanted to use as much of the production sound as possible.
Well, it wouldn't be uncommon where, you know, Frank would take all the time to match in and mix a whole scene that was replaced with ADR. Just after the first playback to say, put all the production back in, I don't care how noisy it is. They didn't want to live with the new performance of the ADR.
They were very, very, very performance conscious on the show, and it's actually amazing how much they remembered the original performances, because if the ADR line didn't match the performance exactly, they would spot it, and so it was more of a performance issue. But with the beach too, I mean, we have great tools available to us to clean a lot of that stuff out, but you have to be really careful in how much you process the dialogue, because then it starts to sound unnatural. And so I was using a variety of tools to clean it up. I would do my first pass by sampling a bit of the waves or the traffic. This one particular tool, it's this plugin called an Isotope RX. It was pretty good because I could sample a little bit of the traffic and it would cancel the traffic out. But then at the same time, we still had a lot of the beach in there, so I would go through with another tool called a cedar noise reduction system and try to get as much of it out as I could with that. And then also what we would do with a lot of the scenes is go mod to mod on them, which is something I typically don't do and would rather not do, but they were so particular about getting the dialogue clean that I would literally go in for the line and sneak back out and go in for the line. Now, that normally becomes apparent, except then Scott would cover me and I'd just look at him and just say, hey, I need some center fill because I've really, you know, gone in and out of these waves. And so the dialogue was a challenge, and it was sort of like boot camp for mixing for 6 years, because now everything else is easy. And, you know,
I did season 1 for you.
Oh, that's
Question
right.
up front?
Yeah, that's right. And so, I mean, it was a great way to learn how to keep dialogue, how to keep the integrity of the dialogue, but still keep it fairly clean and you know, sterile. Our producer could hear things that we couldn't even hear on the track. Like if there was a 16 kilohertz light in the background, he would hear that, and I couldn't. And I was like going, really?
You still hear it? You still hear it?
You still, yeah. I was like, tell me when it's gone. And we nicknamed him affectionately Dog Ears, because I mean he just had a set of ears on him that could pick out stuff that was. So we always, you know, we were always really careful with the dialogue, and we maintained as much of the production dialogue as we could. There were scenes that we had to end up ADRing the entire scenes just because there was just no way around it. there was a scene that they shot that was by a mall, and the location guy decided to pick the area of the mall that had all the compressors going for the air conditioning. And the one character that they decided to shoot that scene with was the guy, the character's name was Faraday, and he talked so low that I talked to his co-star, and she had to learn his lines so she could read his lips on the set so she could know what he was saying. So with him, we didn't stand a chance as far as signal to noise went. We'd have to, it was just, forget it, we got to re-loop these lines. But then he would never say the same lines the same way twice. So the editors couldn't match him into lip sync. So, it was interesting. I mean, it was, when I saw him at the rap party, I just wanted to go up to him and just, tell him you've made my life hell for the last few years. But,
same thing on our end. Cutting the scenes with him was just awful. Because he would rehearse, he'd do all these hesitations and stuff, and he would rehearse them and couldn't do them differently. And the first thing you had to do was like remove all that stuff and just make him say a sentence, and it was really tough. One thing I just wanted to say on the sound side was, those of you that want to be picture editors, we cut sound too. And so if I get a scene that's got tons of surf on one side for one character and no surf on the other side, if the offstage of the quiet side is good enough, I will try to take that track and stuff it on the surf side and replace it in hopes that I can manufacture a track that not only we can literally watch, but that no one will have to loop or something. So, from our end, that's something that we really, it's part of our job too.
Another good tip, just as far as when you're out there shooting your pictures, always roll with sound. Don't ever decide that you're going to shoot a scene MOS, because you just never know. Even if you think it's going to be unusable, it might end up being something that you can sync to, or that walking down the street and door open and close is something that's going to take hours to recreate what you could have just caught when you shot it originally.
Yeah, one of the directors. Oh, I'm sorry.
Nope, keep going.
Now, one of the directors on Undercovers, I was talking to the second unit guy, and the director said, "Yeah, we're going to shoot this scene MOS, and we're not going to record sound." But the second unit guy was savvy enough that he labbed up everybody, he wired everybody up, and so during the scene, it was a wide shot, and they all started ad-libbing, and he liked the ad-lib so much that he kept that in the show. And he went up to the production sound mixer and he said, "Boy, I'm so glad you wired these guys, man, because that was a great scene. We wouldn't have got that." And so it really does, the example, one of the examples that I use all the time when I'm talking about shooting MOS is there was a scene that I was using to demo why you never shoot MOS, because it creates a lot of work that is unnecessary a lot of the time. As a guy, he was on a New York street, walks into a bar, opens the door, walks over to the bar stool, puts his keys down, orders a drink, puts the drink on the table. The bartender pours the drink, and the guy just is staring into space. Well, had the guy not put up that one mic, I tell them, I said, I give the example, now what would you have had to do to recreate all these sounds? You would have had to redo the Foley, the footsteps, do the traffic in the background, do the perspective shift when the door opens, put the guy's keys down, have the bartender pouring the drink. Now, the Foley guys do that anyways, but if you get it with a boom mic, it'll always sound better and always be usable.
Not always, but
sometimes.
We do this a lot where typically the Foley artist will do the same sound as it's in production, and we have to make a choice, and we'll actually audition both and decide which one plays better. And probably 50% of the time, the production effect plays better than the one that was done on the Foley stage or the sound effect.
So we've got time for 2 more questions in the crowd, and then don't forget, they're going to stick around for a little bit over here in this opening. So there's one up here in the front and one in the back, and then we'll wrap this up.
You're splitting tracks using production boom and lavaliers. How do you split those? Do you have designated tracks for the lavaliers?
Are you talking for the
tracks?
ADR or for the production?
For the production.
on the production, our dialogue editor goes through.
Well,
and-
first of all, it's recorded on location with the Diva recorder, a multi-track digital recorder. So he has up to 8 channels. So he typically will record a mix track, which is what Chris cuts with. Then he'll isolate the boom and whatever lavs he has. So what happens is when we reassemble the scene from the EDLs in Pro Tools, we'll have all those separations. So every angle will now have, 8 channels worth of audio. And so then our editor has the choice of using whatever track he wants to. Well, whatever one, if an actor's speaking on camera, he has a choice of either using his lav, or if the boom guy did a good job and it's on mic, he'll have to make a judgment what's best.
The boom is always preferable. If the boom is in tight enough and it has presence, the boom is always preferable because you're getting the room and the ambience around it. There have been a couple of films that I've worked on where they were all the lavs were used because they just sounded better, and I guess the wide shots were so wide that they couldn't use the boom on that. And I've had to work at making it sound like it's in the room. If you can't recreate you can recreate it, but it's much more difficult to make it sound natural, like it is on a boom, because you're picking up the real room.
All right, last question in the back.
So I just wanted to ask, Lost has a lot of, for lack of a better word, abstract sound effects, not the least of which is the smoke monster. But I'm just curious how that process is, the communication between you guys and the sound effects editors. Does it come just like they work on it and they give you a final mix with all the plugins and the processing on it? Or do you guys sort of work together?
There's a combination of things that happen. Originally, when they were creating some of those original sounds, they hired specific sound designers that came up with some of the initial sounds. After that point, a lot of it was the sound designers would bring in multiple tracks to give us flexibility on the stage. They didn't just give us a mix down of those tracks. So we keep talking about the Smoke Monster. They would, and I talked about the multiple layers of tracks. They would give me a set of tracks that were the creature sounds, a set of tracks that were the metallic sounds, another set of tracks that were, some of the, the other, different things. So a lot of these things were created and given to us, but then on the other hand, a lot of them were given a lot of flexibility built with a lot of different tracks.
Right. Did you guys have any kind of discussion process beforehand, or was it just sort of?
Well, we're not involved until it actually gets to the stage. But what's interesting though is we're the ones that get the notes. So a lot of times we'd find ourselves with a set of headphones on, going back while he's working on dialogue. I kept a library through the years of every sound effect we ever used in the show, and I could remember what we'd used from the show last season. I'd go dial it up and I'd pull it in and I'd start cutting in some things. So we actually did help a lot with some of the sound design things as well later in the process.
Yeah. I think that's going to do it for us, folks. I want to give a big round of applause to Frank, Scott, and Chris from Lost. And I just have a couple of quick things to do. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. One last thing before my final announcements and our drawing for the Media Composer 5 software. We'll start down there with you, Scott. Some of these folks in this audience want your job. So what advice do you have to these the students who are just getting ready to graduate to getting into this field? What advice would you give them?
Get a well-rounded education. You need to be proficient at every little step of the process. That's what's great about being in school. You get a chance to do all those things. And if you, like Frank and I, decide you want to specialize in sound, make sure that you can do edit dialogue and edit sound effects, and you know how to mix, and you know how to do location sound, because all those things together are going to give you the tools you need when you get out. And then you need to establish relationships with people in the business, because more than just what you know, it's who you know. And I can go back and look of my first job. It was one of my instructors that I got a job at a studio, and that became my first job. And then it's networking with the people around you and being in the right environment. You have to put yourself in the place where things are happening.